very good. And
Human bubble. We've
not good. Almost in orbit.
Ain't that easy. Commander, go through with this.
leave it open. Red visual on the map.
In the year 2035, the Hermes crew finally arrives on Mars for what is supposed to be a 31-sol research mission. By the 18th sol, the team is out on the surface of Acidalia planitia, carrying out their assigned work. Botanist Mark Watney is busy gathering soil samples for chemical testing when systems operator Bate suddenly receives an urgent dust storm alert from the computer. She quickly warns everyone that they need to return to the surface habitat, known as the hab. As the dark wall of dust begins rolling toward them, Mark and chemist Alex suggest they might be able to ride it out inside the hab. But Commander Melissa Lewis studies the storm's strength and immediately realizes it is far more dangerous than they expected. She decides there is no time to take chances and orders a full evacuation. The crew suits up and prepares to leave, but the moment they open the hab's outer door, the storm slams into them with brutal force. Visibility drops almost instantly, and every step becomes a fight against the wind. Mark stays at the back of the group so he can secure the door behind them. Their biggest concern now is the Mars Ascent Vehicle, or MAV, because if the storm knocks it over, they lose their only way off the planet. Mark believes they might still be able to stabilize it using cables and the rover, but before anyone can act, the satellite communication dish is ripped loose by the wind. The massive dish comes flying through the storm, forcing the astronauts to duck for cover. Everyone manages to avoid it except Mark. The debris strikes him hard and sends him hurtling into the darkness. At the same time, the crew's computer reports that his suit has been breached. The team tries desperately to locate him, but his signal disappears from the scanner, and his vital signs no longer register. Commander Lewis refuses to give up right away. She sends the others toward the MAV while she stays behind for a few more moments, searching through the storm for any sign of him. But Surgeon Chris reminds her that with a damaged suit in those conditions, Mark would almost certainly already be dead. Worse, the storm is now strong enough to threaten the stability of the MAV itself. With no other choice, Melissa is forced to abandon the search, board the vehicle, and approve the launch. The MAV lifts off from Mars, carrying the surviving crew away from the planet while they silently mourn the teammate they believe they lost. Back on Earth, NASA Administrator Teddy Sanders appears before the press and announces that the Mars crew is returning home, but one astronaut did not survive the mission. However, Mark is not dead. After the storm finally passes, he suddenly wakes up on the Martian surface when his suit warning system tells him his oxygen level is dangerously low. A sharp piece of metal, still attached to the broken satellite equipment by a cable, has punctured his suit. Strangely, that same piece of debris also sealed the hole just enough to keep his suit from losing all pressure, which is the only reason he survived. Mark cuts the wire loose and staggers back toward the hab. Once inside, he painfully removes the metal rod from his body, but quickly realizes a smaller fragment is still buried in the wound. Using forceps, he pulls the remaining piece out himself, then seals the injury as best as he can. After stabilizing, he logs into the hab's computer and starts recording a video diary, explaining what happened in case he never gets rescued. The situation is terrifyingly clear. The communication antenna is destroyed, so he has no way to contact NASA. The next planned manned mission to Mars will not arrive for another 4 years, and Mark doubts he has enough supplies to stay alive that long. As another storm builds outside, Mark spends much of the day recovering. Eventually, though, sitting around becomes unbearable. He starts cleaning the hab and sorting through the personal belongings his crewmates left behind, placing their things into labeled boxes. Looking at their photos hits him hard, but it also changes something inside him. Instead of accepting death, Mark makes a decision. He is not going to die on Mars. The next morning, he takes inventory of every bit of food left in the hab, including the special supplies saved for Thanksgiving dinner. Among them are potatoes, and those potatoes give him his first real idea for survival. Since he is a botanist, Mark decides to turn part of the hab into a makeshift greenhouse. He gathers Martian soil, mixes it with the crew's stored bathroom waste to create fertilizer, and plants every potato he has. But growing crops on Mars will require water, and he does not have enough of it. Luckily, Mark has the knowledge, equipment, and spare parts needed to build a device that can burn leftover rocket fuel and use the reaction to produce water. His first attempt does not go smoothly. When he activates the system, the machine catches fire, forcing him to stop and rethink his calculations. After correcting the mistake, he tries again, this time wearing protective gear in case something goes wrong. The second attempt works, giving him the water he needs both for himself and for his growing potato farm. Over the following sols, Mark settles into a routine. He keeps detailed daily video logs, tends to the potato plants, repairs and maintains the equipment, and regularly goes outside to clean and check the solar panels. By Sol 54, his hard work finally pays off. He spots green shoots pushing up through the soil, and for the first time in a long while, he has a reason to smile. Back on Earth, Director of Mars missions Vincent Kapoor meets with Teddy and argues that NASA should begin planning a return mission immediately instead of waiting 4 years. Since the previous expedition was cut short, He believes they owe it to the program to go back. Teddy disagrees. From his point of view, sending another crew so soon would only turn Mark's body into a public spectacle, and the reaction would be terrible. Vincent counters that the situation could be presented differently. NASA could frame the mission as a recovery effort, a way to bring Mark home for his family. Not long after, at the Texas Space Center, an operator receives a request from Vincent asking her to examine specific coordinates on Mars. She brings up satellite imagery of the HAB site and quickly notices something impossible. The area has changed. An emergency call is made, and soon Teddy, Vincent, and NASA's director of media, Annie Montrose, rush to the Space Center to see the images themselves. After studying the evidence, they reach the only conclusion that makes sense. Mark Watney is alive. The discovery immediately creates a new crisis. They begin debating how to handle the situation, because the public will not take it well when they learn NASA accidentally left a living astronaut behind. There's also the emotional damage to consider. If the Hermes crew finds out, they will be crushed by guilt. Teddy worries that even if Mark is alive now, he may eventually starve. Vincent, meanwhile, is just as concerned about Mark's mental state, because from Mark's perspective, it may feel like his own crew abandoned him on Mars. The following day, Teddy holds another press conference and reveals that Mark Watney is still alive. However, he refuses to answer detailed questions because NASA does not yet have enough information. For now, the Hermes crew is kept completely in the dark. By Sol 70, Mark realizes that surviving day by day is no longer enough. If he really wants a chance at rescue, he has to start planning for the distant future. The next crewed mission to Mars is scheduled to land 4 years later, but there is one massive problem. Their landing site is about 32 kilometers away from his current HAB. So even if he manages to stay alive until then, he still has to figure out how to cross a huge stretch of Martian terrain to reach them. The first obstacle is transportation. Mark only has one functioning rover, and under normal conditions, it can travel just 35 kilometers before needing to be recharged. That distance is nowhere near enough for the journey ahead. The second problem is even worse. The full trip would take around 50 days, meaning Mark would have to survive inside a cramped rover with barely enough life support to keep him going. To improve his chances, Mark strips useful parts from the rover that was wrecked during the storm and uses them to upgrade the working one. After some careful modifications, he manages to double its battery capacity. To test it, he takes the rover out during the night, but the drive teaches him something important very quickly. Mars becomes brutally cold after dark, and keeping the heater running would drain too much power from the batteries. When he gets back to the HAB, Mark comes to a risky conclusion. He needs to dig up the radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a device the crew buried earlier because it contains plutonium. It is dangerous, and one careless mistake could turn his survival plan into a disaster. Still, without that extra heat source, long-distance travel may be impossible. Working slowly and cautiously, Mark excavates the generator, removes it without causing an accident, and installs it on the rover to provide steady warmth. Back on Earth, Vincent appears at a public briefing to explain Mark's recent movements, especially because satellite images of the HAB site have already become public. He tells reporters that Mark appears to be preparing for a journey toward the next mission's landing zone. Vincent also admits that if NASA had any way to speak with him, they would tell him to stay where he is and wait for a rescue instead. After the conference, Teddy is not happy. He confronts Vincent for saying that in front of the cameras when NASA still has no guarantee that rescuing Mark is even possible. Teddy also wants a supply probe sent to Mars as soon as possible, so he asks the team how long it would take to build and launch one. They tell him the realistic timeline is 9 months. Teddy immediately rejects that answer and orders everyone to work nonstop until they can finish it in 3. Meanwhile, Flight Director Mitch argues that the Hermes crew deserves to know Mark is alive. Teddy refuses. He believes telling them too early could distract them during their return flight, especially when NASA still has no confirmed rescue plan. By Sol 79, Mark's potato farm finally gives him real food. He harvests the crop, replants the smaller potatoes so they can keep growing, and stores the larger ones as part of his survival supply. But food is only one part of the problem. Communication is still completely broken, and without contact with Earth, every plan he makes is based on guesswork. While studying the map, Mark suddenly gets an idea. He gets into the rover and starts driving in a direction that initially confuses Vincent when NASA sees it through satellite tracking. At first, nobody understands what Mark is doing. Then Vincent checks the map himself, realizes where Mark is headed, and immediately becomes excited. A little later, Mark reaches the old Pathfinder landing site. The probe stopped communicating all the way back in 1997, but if he can recover it and bring it back to life, it might become his first real link to Earth. Mark digs through the Martian sand until he finds the buried probe, loads it onto the rover, and drives it back to the hab. Once he gets it inside, he begins repairing it piece by piece. At the same time on Earth, Vincent hurries to the engineering team and brings out NASA's Pathfinder replica. If Mark can restore the real probe, the engineers can use the copy to figure out how to reconnect with it. After a tense round of work on both planets, the two Pathfinders finally establish contact. NASA receives fresh images from Mars, and everyone in the room realizes they are now looking through Mark's improvised communication system. Mark quickly sets up a sign asking whether they can see him, along with two more signs marked yes and no. NASA rotates Pathfinder's camera until it points directly at yes, and Mark celebrates like he has just won a war. For the first time since the storm, he is no longer completely alone. Now comes the next challenge: how to hold complicated scientific conversations using only a camera and a few handwritten signs. Mark searches through Bates' computer and finds a chart containing alphanumeric codes. He places signs around Pathfinder so NASA can point the camera at different characters and spell out messages. The engineers on Earth quickly understand what he is trying to do and recreate the same setup in their own lab. Once both sides are synced, communication officially begins. Mark tells NASA how he survived the storm and makes it clear that none of this was the crew's fault. After that, NASA starts sending him technical instructions. They explain how he can modify the rover's broadcasting frequency so it can communicate with Pathfinder more efficiently. Mark follows the instructions carefully, step by step. Before long, he receives a message from Vincent saying they have been watching him, the entire world is supporting him, and NASA is already working on rescue options. Vincent also tells him they plan to send a supply mission that will provide enough food to keep him alive. Then Mark asks the question that really matters to him: what about his crew? Vincent has to admit that NASA has not told the Hermes astronauts he is alive yet because they want them focused on their trip home. Mark is furious. To show exactly how he feels, he starts sending a long string of curse words through the communication system, ruining the clean global broadcast NASA had hoped to maintain. Teddy later has to explain the incident to higher-level officials and convince them that Mark's behavior is simply the result of extreme isolation and stress. But Mitch is still not willing to keep the Hermes crew in the dark. Against the official plan, he finds a way to contact them directly. 4 months have passed since the Hermes left Mars. The crew is shocked when they discover a video message waiting for them. They gather around the screen, not knowing what to expect, and watch Mitch reveal the truth. Mark Watney is alive. Just as everyone feared, the news hits them hard. Instead of relief alone, the crew is immediately overwhelmed by guilt, realizing they left their friend behind while he was still breathing. By Sol 128, Mark records another log and complains that NASA now wants constant updates about every little thing he does. They even want to micromanage his potato farm, which annoys him because, as he points out, he is the botanist trapped on Mars, not them. He has also started receiving piles of emails, including one from the president and another from his university. One message gives him a funny technicality to think about. Apparently, once someone grows crops in a new place, that place can be considered colonized. Since Mark has successfully grown potatoes in Martian soil, he proudly declares that he has officially colonized Mars. During the next communication session, NASA asks Mark to pose for a photograph that they can share with the public. Annie expects something dignified and inspiring, but Mark decides to play around instead, making a ridiculous pose for the camera. Annie is irritated because she wanted something graceful and heroic for the media. Teddy, however, tells her to release it anyway, along with the announcement that NASA is preparing a supply mission expected to reach Mark in about 9 months. The supplies Mark has left should technically keep him alive until the rescue package arrives, but Teddy still cannot shake the fear that one unexpected failure could ruin everything. Unfortunately, that fear soon becomes reality. One night after completing routine maintenance outside the hab, Mark heads back inside like usual, but just as he enters, something in the structure fails. The pressure imbalance tears open part of the wall, and within seconds, a violent burst blows the airlock completely off. The detached airlock tumbles across the Martian surface before finally crashing to a stop. Somehow, Mark survives the blast, but his suit is damaged, and oxygen starts leaking out fast. Thinking quickly, he grabs tape and begins sealing every crack he can find. It is a desperate, messy fix, but he manages to stop the leak just before it becomes fatal. Once he gets back into the hab and looks around, the real damage hits him. The explosion has destroyed his potato garden. Every plant he spent months growing is gone. Mark gathers what supplies he can and retreats to the rover for the night. Alone inside the tiny vehicle, the frustration finally breaks through, and he screams in anger before sending NASA a message about what happened. Back on Earth, Vincent calculates the new food situation and tells the team that Mark now has only about 200 days of supplies left. Teddy immediately orders everyone to push harder and speed up work on the supply probe. To help Mark stay emotionally steady, NASA links his communication system with the Hermes, allowing him and his old crew to exchange messages directly. The next day, Mark returns to the ruined garden, clears out the dead crops, and repairs the hole left by the explosion. That night, he tries to ration the remaining potatoes as carefully as possible, but when another storm begins outside, the sound only adds to the pressure building inside him. Meanwhile on Earth, astrodynamicist Rich Purnell is talking with a coworker about the probe's travel time. While joking that Earth and Mars are in a terrible position for a direct rescue, he suddenly realizes there may be another way. At the same time, Teddy is still combing through mission protocols, looking for any step they can shorten without completely breaking safety rules. By Sol 154, Mark has reduced his meals to the smallest amount he can tolerate, even mixing food with medication to stretch his calories further. 4 weeks later, the emergency supply probe is finally ready. Everyone at NASA gathers to watch the launch, hoping this will be the moment that saves him. At first, everything appears to be going according to plan. But then the team notices a serious precession problem. Within minutes, the entire probe fails and explodes. The room goes silent as the hope drains out of everyone. Vincent is left with the painful responsibility of telling Mark the truth when he asks for an update. By Sol 186, Mark sends a message to Commander Melissa Lewis. He asks her that, when she gets back to Earth, she should visit his parents and tell them about everything they experienced on Mars. He wants them to know that he loves them, and if he dies out there, he wants them to understand that he died doing something bigger than himself, something he is proud of. At the same time, officials at the China National Space Administration watch Teddy during a televised interview, where he explains that the supply probe failed because NASA had rushed the process and cut down on inspections. China happens to have a powerful booster that could give NASA another chance at a faster launch, but the technology is classified. If they help, the arrangement must remain secret, and the world can never know the full details. Soon after, Teddy receives a call from China. He agrees to their confidentiality terms, and NASA suddenly has a new chance. While engineers begin working to prepare another probe within only 28 days, Rich finishes his calculations and flies out to meet Vincent, convinced he has found a better solution. Vincent calls a meeting, where Rich explains his plan in the strangest way possible, using a stapler, Annie, and Teddy as props. Instead of sending the supply probe straight to Mars, Rich suggests using the Chinese booster to launch it toward the Hermes. The crew would intercept the supplies, then use Earth's gravity for a slingshot maneuver. This would preserve their speed and send them back toward Mars much faster, giving them a real shot at rescuing Mark. Mark, meanwhile, would have to travel to the other MAV and meet them there. The problem is that this plan would add another 500 days to the Hermes cruise mission. Mitch believes Melissa and the others should be allowed to choose for themselves whether they are willing to do it. Teddy refuses. He does not want to risk the lives of an entire crew on a maneuver that could fail, so he announces that NASA will stick with the safer original plan instead of Rich's proposal. But aboard the Hermes, Bate discovers an encrypted message hidden in their system. After decoding it, she realizes it contains Rich's rescue plan. The crew gathers to talk it through, and Melissa makes sure everyone fully understands what they are agreeing to. If they go through with it, they will not see their families for more than another year. Because NASA did not officially approve the maneuver, it could also be considered mutiny, meaning they may face court-martial when they return. And on top of all that, the slingshot itself could go wrong and kill every one of them. Even after hearing all the risks, no one backs out. One by one, the crew votes to go back for Mark. At NASA, the team receives a message from Bate that includes a joke about Rich, and then they notice something much more serious. The Hermes has changed course. Teddy realizes the crew has chosen Rich's plan whether NASA approved it or not. With no way to stop them, he sends Annie to face the press and explain the new rescue strategy. Teddy also figures out that Mitch secretly passed the information to the Hermes. He tells Mitch that once the mission is over, he will have to resign. By Sol 219, Mark begins modifying the rover for the long journey ahead. He needs to carry as much equipment and survival gear as possible because he has to travel all the way to the crater where the other MAV is located. NASA runs matching tests in their own labs and keeps sending him updated instructions to help him make the rover suitable for the trip. Chinese scientists arrive at NASA to help with the booster work, though cooperation is not always smooth because of language barriers and cultural differences. Meanwhile, aboard the Hermes, the crew calls their families and explains that their homecoming has been delayed. Instead of seeing them soon, their loved ones will now have to wait another 500 days. After weeks of work, Mark finally has the upgraded rover ready for the long trip. He takes it out for a test drive to make sure every system is functioning the way it should. Back on Earth, the new booster also passes its test successfully, and soon the supply probe launches without any major problem. When it reaches the right position near Earth, the Hermes intercepts it, and the crew attaches the supplies to their ship. 7 months pass, and Mark finally prepares to leave the hab for good. Before going, he records one last video log and begins shutting down every system inside the habitat. Then he writes Sol 461 on the wall, signs his name beside it, and climbs into the rover. The journey ahead is long, dangerous, and lonely. Since the rover cannot drive endlessly, Mark has to stop again and again to recharge it using the solar panels he removed from the hab. During those breaks, he looks out across the Martian landscape, taking in the silence and reminding himself that he is probably the first human being to ever see most of these places. While the batteries recharge, he also uses the time to sleep. By Sol 517, Mitch and the engineering team discover a serious new problem. The Hermes cannot enter Mars orbit because doing so would burn too much fuel and leave the crew without enough to return home. The MAV can only reach low orbit, which means Mark must launch at a much higher speed if he is going to escape Mars' gravity and meet the Hermes. To make that possible, they need to reduce the MAV's weight by about 5,000 kilograms. Mitch suggests stripping out anything that is not absolutely necessary. Seats, control panels, unnecessary hardware, and even parts of the survival system. Mark will have to wear his spacesuit inside the vehicle just to breathe, while the Hermes crew pilots the MAV remotely. And because backup communication systems also have to go, there will be almost no margin for error. The plan gets even crazier. They need to remove the nose airlock in the windows, then cover the top of the MAV with canvas instead. Every part of this plan is dangerous, and the chances of failure are terrifyingly high, but there is no better option left. When NASA sends the instructions to Mark, his response is simple and very Mark-like, the F word. On Sol 538, Mark finally reaches the crater where the second MAV is waiting. He records another log, mostly to rant about how completely insane the rescue plan is. Still, even he has to admit that the idea of becoming the fastest man in the history of space travel sounds pretty cool. After that, he gets to work. He begins removing everything NASA told him to remove, stripping the MAV down to its bare minimum, and covering the top with canvas like the world's most expensive emergency patch job. By Sol 560, Commander Lewis goes over the final rescue plan aboard the Hermes. She assigns each crew member a specific role, making sure everyone knows exactly what they have to do. The entire operation has to be perfect, and if something goes wrong, the crew is ready to leave the Hermes themselves and go after Mark in open space. The next day, Mark eats the last of his food. Before leaving the rover behind, he writes a note for whichever astronaut finds it in the future, asking them to take care of it because that rover kept him alive. Meanwhile, back on Earth, crowds gather outside NASA and in major cities around the world. Everyone is watching the rescue attempt, waiting to see whether Mark Watney will finally come home. Mark shaves off his beard, cuts his hair, puts on his suit, and climbs into the MAV once the Hermes is close enough. They can finally speak to him through voice communication instead of text messages. Hearing his crew again overwhelms him, and he starts crying as he thanks them for coming back. Melissa begins the countdown, and the MAV launches from Mars. At first, everything seems to go smoothly. But after only a few minutes, the canvas covering tears away, and the sudden pressure change hits Mark hard. He becomes dizzy and passes out. The Hermes shuts down the booster remotely and checks the trajectory, only to discover another problem. The MAV has run out of fuel and is now much farther from the ship than planned. The crew can use some of their reserve fuel to adjust, but doing that will make them move too fast for a clean interception. Then Mark wakes up and tells them he is fine, as long as nobody counts the broken ribs. Once he hears about the distance problem, he he comes up with a ridiculous solution. He suggests puncturing his own suit and using the escaping air like a tiny thruster to push himself toward the Hermes. It is a terrible plan, but it gives Melissa an idea that is only slightly less dangerous. Instead of using Mark's suit as a thruster, they can blow one of the Hermes airlocks. The escaping air would push the ship in the direction they need, giving them the extra movement required to close the gap. It is risky, but they are completely out of safer choices. Melissa calls Alex and tells him to start making a bomb. Using supplies on the ship, including simple sugar, Alex creates an explosive even stronger than dynamite. Chris prepares the device and sets it on the airlock before floating back to safety. In the cockpit, the final calculations show that even after the explosion, there will still be a small distance between them and Mark. Melissa immediately decides she will go outside herself, rushing to suit up for the rescue. The bomb detonates, destroying the airlock and giving the Hermes the push they needed. Once the ship gets as close to the MAV as possible, Chris secures Melissa to a line, and she heads out into space. But when she reaches the end of the tether, they realize it is still not long enough. That is when Mark decides to use his original idea. He punctures his suit, and the escaping air instantly sends him spinning out of control. For a few terrifying moments, he struggles to steady himself, but eventually he manages to aim himself away from the MAV and toward Melissa. With the crew constantly updating the numbers, Melissa adjusts her own position and reaches for him as he flies past. He is moving too fast, and their hands only collide for a second. But somehow Mark manages to grab onto the tether. Melissa pulls him in, and after everything he has survived, they finally reunite in space. The crew brings both of them safely back inside the Hermes, then sends the message to Earth. The rescue was successful. All around the world, people erupt in celebration. Mark Watney is alive, and he is finally going home. After recovering from the entire ordeal and regaining his health, Mark begins a new chapter as a survival instructor for future astronaut candidates. 3 years later, a brand new mission to Mars launches successfully, carrying humanity forward once again. There's a certain kind of movie that sounds exhausting when you describe it out loud. A man gets stranded alone on Mars. He has barely any supplies, no easy way to call home, and the closest help is not just far away, it's impossibly far away. On paper, that could easily turn into 2 hours of one guy walking around red dust, talking to himself, fixing equipment, and slowly losing his mind. But somehow, The Martian doesn't feel like that kind of movie. That's probably the first thing that stands out about it. This is a space survival story, yes, but it doesn't come at you like a cold science lecture or some painfully serious prestige drama where every scene is trying to crush you emotionally. It has danger, it has tension, it has the whole one mistake and you're dead atmosphere that space movies naturally carry, but it also has this surprisingly light, accessible energy. It's the kind of film that takes a terrifying situation and still manages to make it feel entertaining without making the danger feel fake. And that balance is not as easy as it looks. Because The Martian is dealing with a very simple hook, Mark Watney is left behind on Mars after his crew believes he's dead. That's the movie. That's the engine. There's no villain hiding in the shadows, no alien creature stalking the base, no massive conspiracy secretly controlling NASA. The threat is just survival itself. Food, water, air, distance, time. Mars doesn't care whether he lives or dies, and that's what makes the setup work. But what makes the movie so broadly watchable is that it doesn't treat survival as pure misery. It turns problem-solving into entertainment. Watney isn't just sitting there waiting to be rescued. He's thinking, testing, failing, adjusting, and trying again. The movie understands that watching someone use their brain can be just as exciting as watching explosions, if the rhythm is right. And honestly, that's where the mass appeal comes in. You don't have to be a space nerd to enjoy The Martian. You don't need to understand every scientific detail. The film gives you enough information to follow the situation, but it doesn't bury you under technical language. It makes science feel practical, immediate, almost like a survival tool. You're not watching characters explain things just to sound smart. You're watching them solve problems because someone's life depends on it. At the same time, it still feels like a big mainstream movie. It has the wide cast, the huge rescue mission, the NASA control rooms, the dramatic space visuals, the public attention back on Earth, and that crowd-pleasing feeling of people coming together to bring one man home. It's smart enough to make you feel engaged, but simple enough to keep the story moving. That's probably why The Martian connected with so many people. It's not just a movie about space. It's a movie about competence, patience, humor, and refusing to give up when the situation is absurdly unfair. There's something satisfying about watching characters who are actually good at their jobs. They don't spend the whole movie making stupid decisions just to create drama. Most of the time, they're trying their best, thinking clearly, and working against problems that are already hard enough. And for a film that runs well over 2 hours, it rarely feels like it's dragging. The story keeps shifting between Watney alone on Mars, NASA trying to figure out what to do, and the crew dealing with the consequences of leaving him behind. That structure gives the movie movement. Just when the isolation might become too much, we cut back to Earth. Just when the politics might slow things down, we return to Watney trying to survive with whatever he has left. So as an opening impression, The Martian feels like one of those rare big studio films that manages to be intelligent without becoming dry, emotional without becoming miserable, and funny without completely breaking the tension. It's a space survival film, but it's also a crowd pleaser, and that combination is exactly why it works. The whole story really begins with one bad decision that, in the moment, doesn't even feel like a bad decision. The Ares III crew is on Mars, doing what they came there to do, collecting samples, working the mission, treating this impossible place almost like a work site, and then the storm hits, not a small storm either. The kind of storm where everything immediately stops feeling controlled. The mission goes from scientific exploration to pure emergency in seconds. Equipment is getting battered, visibility drops, the crew has to move fast, and suddenly Mars doesn't look like a fascinating discovery anymore. It looks like a planet that wants them gone. And that's where the movie makes its first big turn. Mark Watney gets struck, separated from the crew, and his suit readings make it look like he's dead. From the crew's side, there isn't really a comfortable choice here. They don't just casually leave him behind. That part matters. The commander believes she has already lost one astronaut, and if she waits too long, she could lose the entire crew. So they leave, and it's a brutal moment because the film doesn't need to over-explain it. You understand the pressure. You understand the panic. You understand why they make the call, even if the result is horrifying. It's not betrayal. It's not cowardice. It's the kind of terrible decision space travel would force on people when there is no time to be heroic in the movie trailer sense. Then the dust settles, and Mark wakes up. That's the part where The Martian quietly becomes something more interesting than just another space disaster movie. Because the mission disaster is not the whole film, it's the doorway into the actual story. Watney is alive, but nobody knows it. His crew is already gone. NASA thinks they're dealing with a death. Earth is preparing to mourn him, and he's standing there on Mars, injured, alone, probably looking around and realizing the full absurdity of what just happened. It's such a clean setup, almost painfully simple. A man is left behind on a planet where human beings are not supposed to survive. The people who left him didn't mean to. The people who can save him don't even know there's anyone to save. And the distance between those two truths is basically the movie. What I like about this opening disaster is that it doesn't feel like it exists just for spectacle. Yes, the storm gives the film a big dramatic start, and yes, visually it's intense. But the more important thing is what it does emotionally. It creates guilt for the crew, shock for NASA, and a survival clock for Watney before he even has a plan. The movie could have easily made this opening louder, more chaotic, more dramatic in that obvious blockbuster way. Instead, the strongest part is the aftermath. That silence after the crew leaves, the emptiness of Mars. The realization that there's no rescue ship waiting just over the hill. And from that moment, the question becomes very direct. What do you do when the entire world thinks you're dead, and you're the only person who knows they're wrong? What makes The Martian work so well early on is that Mars never feels like a place waiting to be conquered. It's not presented as some magical frontier with hidden wonders around every corner. It's not romantic in that old-school sci-fi way, where space feels mysterious and beautiful and full of possibility. Here, Mars is mostly just empty, huge, silent, cold, and completely uninterested in Mark Watney's survival. And that's scary in a very different way. There's no monster chasing him, no alien civilization watching from the mountains, no dramatic enemy hiding in the shadows. The planet itself is the enemy, but not because it is evil. It's dangerous because it simply does not care. If Watney runs out of food, Mars won't react. If his oxygen system fails, Mars won't pause. If one tiny piece of equipment breaks at the wrong time, the whole situation can collapse in seconds. That kind of danger is quieter, but it sticks with you. The film keeps reminding us that humans are not built for this place. The air is useless, the soil is dead, water is barely accessible, the temperature can become brutal. Even the open landscape, which looks beautiful in wide shots, starts to feel less like freedom and more like a prison with no walls. That's a clever visual trick, honestly. Because most survival films trap the character somewhere tight, an island, a room, a boat, a cave. The Martian does the opposite. Mark has an entire planet around him, but none of it is actually available to him. He can walk, drive, look out across the horizon, and still be completely trapped. Mars is massive, but for him, survival comes down to one small habitat, a rover, a few tools, and whatever supplies were left behind. The movie also does a good job making the environment feel believable without turning every scene into a science lesson. You don't need a lecture to understand the threat. You see it in the suits, the airlocks, the cracked equipment, the careful routines. Every time Watney steps outside, there's this unspoken feeling that he is only alive because a thin layer of technology is separating him from instant death. And that makes every ordinary task feel heavier. Growing food is not just farming, it's a miracle attempt. Driving somewhere is not just travel, it's a risk calculation. Fixing a damaged part is not just maintenance. It could be the difference between living another week or becoming part of the landscape. That's why Mars is more than a backdrop in this film. It shapes every decision. It turns simple needs into impossible problems. It forces Watney to stay alert, stay disciplined, and keep solving one crisis after another. And even though the film has humor and upbeat moments, it never completely lets you forget where he is. One man alone on a planet that gives him nothing for free. That's the real tension of Mars in The Martian. It doesn't attack him, it just waits for him to make one mistake. Once Mark Watney realizes he's alive, the relief only lasts for about half a second. Because surviving the accident is not the same thing as surviving Mars. That's the nasty little truth at the center of The Martian. He wakes up injured, alone, and completely cut off from everyone who could help him. His crew is gone. NASA thinks he's dead. There's no phone call he can make, no emergency button that magically fixes the situation, no rescue team already on the way. He is alive, yes, but in practical terms, he has been abandoned on a planet that was never meant to keep him alive, and the movie is smart enough to let that sink in. Watney doesn't just have one problem. He has a stack of problems, and each one is connected to the next. He needs food, he needs water, he needs oxygen, he needs shelter, he needs communication, he needs power. He needs to stay mentally stable long enough to solve problems that would break most people in a normal emergency, let alone on Mars. That's what makes his situation feel so overwhelming. It isn't just how does he get home. That question is almost too big to deal with at first. The real question is smaller and more immediate. How does he survive today, then tomorrow, then the day after that? And then somehow long enough for Earth to even realize there's still a man worth rescuing. There's something quietly terrifying about that, because Watney is not fighting a single disaster. He's fighting time. Every meal he eats reduces his supply. Every repair uses resources. Every plan depends on equipment that was not designed for this kind of long-term survival. Even his hope has to be managed carefully, because hope without a plan is useless out there. But this is also where the movie starts to become weirdly satisfying. Instead of collapsing immediately, Watney forces himself to think. He breaks the impossible into pieces. He doesn't solve Mars in one genius move. He starts with what he can control. Patch the wound, count the food, check the systems, understand the limits, find the next step. That practical rhythm is what pulls the audience in. You're not just watching a man suffer. You're watching a man negotiate with disaster, one problem at a time. And Matt Damon's performance really matters here, because this situation could have easily become too heavy or too flat. If Watney was miserable every second, the film might become exhausting. If he was too casual, the danger would disappear. Damon plays him somewhere in the middle, scared, irritated, clever, stubborn, sometimes joking because the alternative is probably screaming. That feels human. The situation is impossible, but Watney doesn't act like a superhero. He acts like someone who knows he should be dead, but since he isn't, he might as well get to work, and that's the hook. The Martian isn't asking whether Mars is dangerous. We already know it is. The real question is whether one person, with enough intelligence, patience, and sheer refusal to quit, can stretch a hopeless situation just long enough for a miracle to become possible. One of the easiest ways to understand The Martian is to think of it as a survival movie first and a space movie second. Yes, it has NASA, Mars missions, spacecraft, science calculations, all of that. But underneath the technology, the bones of the story are very old-fashioned. A man is stranded somewhere far from civilization. Nobody can reach him. Nobody even knows at first that he needs reaching. So he has to look around, take stock of what he has, and figure out how to stay alive. That's why the comparisons to Robinson Crusoe and Castaway make sense. The difference, of course, is that Mark Watney doesn't wash up on a tropical island. He wakes up on Mars. There are no trees, no ocean, no animals, no natural shelter, no chance of finding food if he just searches long enough. This is survival stripped down to the most extreme version of the idea. He isn't lost somewhere on Earth. He is lost somewhere Earth can barely touch. And that gives the movie a strange kind of freshness, even though the structure is familiar. Because we know this type of story. We've seen the lone survivor before. We've seen characters forced to talk to themselves, create routines, invent solutions, and fight boredom as much as hunger. But putting that story on Mars changes the pressure completely. A mistake that might be inconvenient in another survival film could be fatal here. A damaged tool is not just a setback. A broken system is not just bad luck. It might be the end. What keeps it from feeling like a simple copy of those older survival stories is Watney's environment. Castaway had nature, loneliness, and time. The Martian has all of that, but with math breathing down the character's neck. Every day can be counted. Every supply can be measured. Every possible rescue window sits far beyond what his food supply can handle. So the movie becomes less about can he live alone, and more about can he outthink the numbers. That's where the survival setup really clicks. Watney has to become his own farmer, engineer, mechanic, doctor, and motivational speaker. There's nobody else in the room to calm him down when things go wrong. There's no partner to share the fear with. If he panics, the panic wastes time. If he gives up, that's it. And still, the film doesn't drown in sadness. That's important. A story like this could easily become 2 hours of misery, but the Martian keeps finding little sparks of life inside the isolation. Watney complains. He jokes. He gets annoyed by the music. He records his thoughts because, honestly, what else is he supposed to do? Those little human habits stop him from becoming just a survival case and turn him into someone you actually want to follow. The Castaway comparison also puts a lot of pressure on the lead actor. In that kind of story, the movie can't hide behind side plots forever. At some point, it's just one person on screen, and either you believe in them or you don't. For a lot of viewers, Matt Damon makes that work. He gives Watney enough charm and intelligence that spending long stretches with him doesn't feel like homework, and that's probably why this familiar setup lands as well as it does. The Martian takes a very classic survival idea, one man abandoned, one impossible landscape, one long fight to stay alive, and gives it a modern space-age shape. It's Robinson Crusoe with oxygen systems. Castaway with NASA watching from millions of miles away, and somehow, that combination is exactly what makes the movie so easy to get pulled into. This is where The Martian starts to become weirdly fun. Because once Mark Watney understands how bad his situation is, the movie doesn't just sit there and ask us to feel sorry for him. It lets him work. And honestly, watching him work is one of the most satisfying parts of the whole film. He looks at Mars, this dead, dry, completely unhelpful planet, and basically decides, fine, I'll make it useful. That's where his botany background becomes more than just a character detail. It becomes the one thing that might keep him alive. He isn't the strongest man in space. He isn't some action hero who can punch his way through a crisis. His weapon is knowledge. Soil, water, food, waste, temperature, pressure, all the boring-sounding stuff that suddenly becomes life or death when you're trapped on another planet. And then come the potatoes. On paper, that sounds almost silly. A man stranded on Mars survives by farming potatoes. It could have easily become laughable if the movie handled it wrong. But because the situation is so desperate, and because Watney approaches it with this mixture of intelligence and stubborn humor, the potato-growing plan becomes strangely gripping. You're sitting there watching dirt, plastic sheets, calculations, rationing, and little green plants, and somehow it matters. That's the trick. The film makes survival feel practical. It doesn't turn every solution into a magical genius moment. Watney has to build things, test things, make messes, and take risks. Some ideas work, some go wrong. And when something breaks, it's not just a setback for the plot. It feels like a punch in the stomach, because you understand what it cost him. His resourcefulness also gives the movie a very different kind of tension. This isn't just suspense built around explosions or chase scenes. It's suspense built around process. Can he stretch the food supply? Can he create water? Can he keep the habitat safe? Can he make old equipment do something it was never really meant to do? And the best part is, the movie lets us follow enough of the process to feel included. We're not just told, he's smart, trust us. We actually see him think through problems. We see the steps, we see the limits. We see how every solution creates another problem waiting behind it. That makes Watney feel believable as a survivor. Not because everything he does is easy, and not because the movie is pretending he has perfect answers, but because he refuses to treat the situation as hopeless. He keeps reducing the impossible into smaller tasks. Grow food, make water, find a way to communicate, stay alive long enough for the next plan. There's something genuinely inspiring about that, even if the movie keeps it light. Because survival here is not about bravery in the loud, heroic sense. It's about discipline. It's about patience. It's about doing the next ugly, boring, necessary thing when nobody is around to clap for you. Watney doesn't survive because Mars becomes kinder. Mars never changes. He survives because he learns how to squeeze life out of a place that gives him almost nothing. And that's what makes the potatoes more than just a funny plot point. They become proof that Watney is still fighting. Tiny green signs of life in the middle of a planet that looks completely dead. For a movie this big, with spacecraft and NASA and rescue missions, it's kind of funny that one of its strongest images is just a man trying to grow dinner. But somehow, that's exactly why it works. One of the most enjoyable things about The Martian is that it makes problem-solving feel exciting. That sounds simple, maybe even a little boring, but it's actually a huge part of why the movie works. This is not a film where survival comes from luck every 5 minutes, or from some last-second heroic stunt pulled out of nowhere. Most of the tension comes from watching smart people run into impossible problems, and then slowly, carefully, stubbornly try to solve them. And for some reason, that is incredibly satisfying to watch. Watney's whole attitude is built around this idea. He doesn't waste much time asking why this happened to him. I mean, he has moments of frustration, obviously. He's human, but once the shock passes, his brain goes straight into work mode. What do I have? What do I need? What can be repaired? What can be reused? What can be stretched longer than it was ever meant to last? That's the rhythm of the movie. One problem leads to another. Then that solution creates a new problem. Then the new problem has to be broken down again. It's almost like watching a survival puzzle unfold in real time, except the pieces are food, oxygen, water, communication equipment, distance, and a rescue window that feels ridiculously far away. And the film understands that process can be dramatic. A lot of movies treat science like decoration. Characters say big technical words, screens flash, someone types very fast, and suddenly the plot moves forward. The Martian is a little different. It actually wants you to care about the steps. It wants you to understand why a small calculation matters, why one broken system is terrifying, why one successful experiment can feel like a victory. That's where the movie gets its science the problem energy. It turns intelligence into action. Watney isn't just smart in a vague movie way. He survives because he applies what he knows. He studies the situation, tests ideas, makes adjustments, and accepts that failure is part of the process. The same thing happens back on Earth, where NASA isn't just staring at monitors looking worried. They're building plans, debating risks, calculating rescue options, and trying to turn a hopeless situation into something technically possible. And honestly, it's refreshing to watch characters who are competent. Nobody has to become stupid just to create drama. The drama is already there. Mars is dangerous enough. Time is short enough. The distance is absurd enough. The movie doesn't need people making ridiculous choices every 2 minutes. It gets tension from people doing their jobs well and still barely keeping up with the scale of the problem. That gives The Martian a very different kind of momentum. It's not just, will Mark survive? It's, how will he survive the next thing? And that how matters. The film keeps pulling you into the mechanics of survival without turning itself into a lecture. You start to feel the satisfaction of each small win, a repaired system, a successful crop, a message sent. A plan that might maybe, possibly work if nothing else goes wrong. Of course, some viewers may feel the solutions come a little too neatly. That criticism is fair. There are moments where the movie's problem-solving feels almost too clean, too convenient, too perfectly timed for a mainstream blockbuster. But even then, the appeal is hard to deny, because the movie is so good at making the process feel alive. It gives you that rare blockbuster pleasure of watching people think, not just fight, not just run, think. And in a survival story like this, that becomes the real action. Every idea is a lifeline. Every calculation is a risk. Every solution buys Watney a little more time on a planet that is waiting for him to slip. That's why the problem-solving in The Martian feels so satisfying. It makes intelligence cinematic. It takes science, pressure, humor, and desperation, and turns them into the heartbeat of the entire film. What's interesting about The Martian is that it is clearly a science-heavy movie, but it doesn't behave like one in the boring way people might expect. You hear astronauts stranded on Mars, and you almost prepare yourself for long explanations, complicated mission language, and characters standing around saying things that sound important but don't really connect emotionally. That could have happened here very easily. The story is full of technical problems. Food supply, oxygen, water, communication, launch windows, orbital paths, there's a lot going on, but the movie has a pretty smart trick. It makes the science feel like survival. That changes everything, because now the technical details are not just information, they are the story. When Watney explains what he needs to do, we're not listening because we want a science lesson. We're listening because if this doesn't work, he might die. That instantly gives every calculation and every experiment a reason to exist, and the film keeps the explanation surprisingly simple. It doesn't talk down to the audience, but it also doesn't act like you need a degree to follow along. Most of the science is presented through action. Watney needs food, so he figures out how to grow it. He needs water, so he experiments. He needs communication, so he starts looking for old equipment and possible signals. The movie gives you enough to understand the problem, then lets the tension come from whether the solution will actually work. That's why the science becomes fun instead of heavy. You feel included in the thinking process. You're not just watching a genius do genius things while everyone else claps. You're watching a man explain his logic in a way that feels practical, sometimes messy, sometimes funny, sometimes desperate. He makes mistakes. He gets annoyed. He celebrates small wins like they're huge victories because out there they are. And that tone matters a lot. The Martian never lets the science become too dry because Watney himself refuses to become dry. He talks through problems with this casual, slightly sarcastic energy, almost like he's trying to keep himself entertained as much as he's trying to document his survival. That makes the technical stuff easier to digest. It gives the audience a personality to attach to, not just a list of procedures. Even the people at NASA are handled in a similar way. They're serious, obviously. A man's life is at stake. But the movie doesn't make them feel like lifeless experts reading from manuals. They argue, joke, panic quietly, push ideas forward, and sometimes get excited by a possible solution before realizing how dangerous it actually is. That human reaction makes the science feel alive, and for a mainstream audience, that's probably one of the film's biggest strengths. It manages to make intelligence entertaining, not in a show-off way, but in a very direct, accessible way. You understand the basics, you understand the stakes, and even when the details get bigger, orbital rescue plans, launch timing, supply missions, the movie keeps pulling everything back to the same emotional point. Can this help bring Mark home? That question keeps the film clear. So even viewers who don't normally care about space science can still enjoy the ride. The Martian gives them a survival story first, and then quietly sneaks the science into the excitement. It's not asking you to admire technical accuracy from a distance. It's inviting you to root for science because science, in this story, is the closest thing Watney has to hope, and that's why it works so well. The movie makes science feel useful, human, funny, dangerous, and strangely emotional. It turns equations and experiments into little acts of defiance against a planet that keeps saying, "You shouldn't be alive." Watney's answer basically is, "Okay, let me calculate a way around that." One of the funniest things about The Martian is how much of its reputation seems tied to one question: is this actually realistic? And honestly, that question kind of follows the movie around whether you want it to or not, because The Martian presents itself in a very grounded way. It doesn't feel like fantasy space adventure. It doesn't have aliens, laser battles, impossible planets, or people casually bending the laws of the universe every 10 minutes. The movie clearly wants you to feel like this could happen, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not exactly like this, but close enough that your brain accepts the situation. For the most part, it works. The Mars environment feels believable. The NASA procedures feel serious. The problems feel practical. Watney's survival is built around food, water, oxygen, pressure, distance, communication, all the basic things that would actually matter if a human being was stranded somewhere humans are not supposed to live. And because the film explains those problems so cleanly, it becomes easy to believe in the world of the movie. You might not understand every technical detail. Most viewers won't, but you believe the characters understand it. That's the key. When Watney talks through a plan, or when the NASA team debates a rescue option, the movie gives everything enough weight and confidence that you don't sit there questioning every line. You just go with it because the film has created a sense of intelligence around the story. Still, there is another side to this, because the more realistic a movie tries to feel, the more people start measuring it against reality. And The Martian definitely opens itself up to that. Some viewers look at the storm, the rescue plans, the perfect timing, the convenient solutions, and start to feel the movie stretching believability. The story is grounded, yes, but it is still a mainstream survival adventure. It still needs drama. It still needs close calls. It still needs big emotional moments and last-minute problem-solving. So there's this constant tension between science fact and movie logic. That's not automatically a bad thing. In fact, it's probably part of why the film is so enjoyable. If The Martian was completely dry and perfectly realistic in every tiny detail, it might have turned into a technical manual with a movie camera attached. But if it went too far the other way, it would lose the grounded quality that makes the danger feel real. The film is always walking that line. Sometimes it feels impressively convincing. You see Watney carefully rationing supplies, repairing systems, making use of leftover equipment, and you think, okay, I buy this. Other times, the solutions arrive with that polished Hollywood smoothness, where every impossible problem somehow has a clever answer waiting nearby. That can make certain moments feel a little too easy, especially for viewers who wanted something harsher or more psychologically brutal. And I get that criticism. There are times when Watney's survival almost feels less like a desperate nightmare and more like an extremely difficult workplace challenge. He gets angry, he struggles, things go wrong, but the movie rarely lets him sink into true hopelessness for long. Some people love that optimism. Others might feel it makes the whole ordeal less believable. But here's the thing. The Martian is not really trying to be a documentary about dying on Mars. It's trying to be an intelligent crowd pleaser. It wants the science to feel real enough that the stakes matter, but not so punishing that the audience stops having fun. That's why the movie can talk about botany, orbital timing, oxygen systems, and rescue logistics, while still feeling light and entertaining. It's using scientific realism as a foundation, not as a cage. And for a lot of viewers, that's enough. You don't have to believe every single detail could happen exactly this way. You just have to believe that in the world of the film, these people are smart, the danger is serious, and the solutions are earned enough to keep you invested. Most of the time, The Martian clears that bar. But the criticism still matters because it points to the movie's biggest balancing act. The more it asks us to admire its realism, the more noticeable the convenient pieces become. The more it presents Watney as a practical scientist surviving through logic, the more some viewers will question whether the plot is quietly helping him too much. So the film sits in an interesting middle ground. It feels realistic enough to be gripping, but cinematic enough to be entertaining. It respects science, but it also respects pacing. It gives us plausible danger, then shapes that danger into a clean, satisfying movie experience. And depending on what you want from The Martian, that can either be its greatest strength or the thing that keeps it from feeling completely honest. As much as The Martian earns a lot of goodwill with its intelligence and energy, there is one criticism that keeps hovering around the movie. Sometimes things line up a little too nicely, not always in a way that ruins the film, but enough that you can feel the machinery of the story working underneath the surface. Mark Watney is stranded on Mars, which is already an almost impossible situation, but then the movie keeps revealing just enough tools, just enough knowledge, just enough leftover equipment, and just enough lucky timing to keep the story moving. And depending on your mood, that can either feel satisfying or a bit too convenient. The biggest example is right there in Watney himself. He just happens to be a botanist. Out of all the astronauts who could have been left behind on a lifeless planet, the one who survives is the guy who understands plants, soil, and how to turn a dead environment into something that can grow food. Now, of course, the movie needs that. Without it, there is no potato survival plan, no clever farming angle, no central hook of him using biology to push back against Mars. But still, you can understand why some viewers might raise an eyebrow. It's that feeling of, well, lucky he had exactly the right skill for exactly this disaster. The same thing happens with some of the equipment. The habitat, the rover, old mission hardware, supplies that can be repurposed, all of it gives Watney something to do, and most of it is entertaining to watch. But at certain points, you can feel the plot quietly placing useful objects within reach. Not handing him everything exactly, but giving him just enough pieces to build the next solution. And that's where The Martian becomes a very polished survival fantasy. Not fantasy in the dragons and magic sense, obviously. More like a fantasy of competence, preparation, and problem-solving. Every crisis is terrible, but it's also solvable. Every disaster is frightening, but not meaningless. There is almost always a next step, a next calculation, a next idea, a next person at NASA who can spot the missing piece. For many viewers, that's the appeal. It's comforting to watch a movie where smart people face hard problems and actually behave like smart people. But for others, the smoothness can make the danger feel a little softened. Mars is deadly, yes, but the story has a way of turning death traps into puzzles with answers, and that can create a strange distance. You know Watney is in danger, but you also start to sense that the movie likes him too much to let the danger become truly ugly. It pushes him, injures him, scares him, ruins his plans, but it rarely lets the situation become as hopeless as it probably would be in real life. The film wants intensity, but it also wants fun. It wants realism, but it also wants the audience to leave satisfied. That balance mostly works, but the convenient plotting is part of the price. Even the rescue side has moments where the timeline, the politics, the calculations, and the teamwork all come together in that very clean Hollywood way. People argue, yes. Plans fail, yes. But there's still a strong sense that the movie is guiding everyone toward the most crowd-pleasing version of the story. And honestly, I don't think that makes The Martian a bad film. It just makes it a specific kind of film. This is not the harshest possible version of being abandoned on Mars. It is not trying to psychologically destroy the audience. It's not interested in making every solution messy to the point of despair. It's a mainstream survival adventure built around optimism, ingenuity, and the pleasure of watching impossible problems become manageable. So when the plot feels convenient, it depends on how much you're willing to accept the movie's tone. If you want brutal realism, some of these moments may feel too easy. If you want a smart, hopeful, entertaining survival story, the contrivances may not bother you much at all. They're part of the movie's design. They keep the rhythm moving. They keep Watney active. They allow the film to remain light enough for a wide audience without completely abandoning the danger. Still, it's worth admitting that The Martian sometimes makes survival look a little cleaner than it should. Not effortless, not simple, but clean, and maybe that's the real criticism. The movie is full of dust, danger, broken equipment, and desperate calculations, yet the storytelling itself is extremely tidy. Every piece has a purpose. Every obstacle is shaped for momentum. Every solution feels designed to keep hope alive. For some people, that neatness is inspiring. For others, it's the exact thing that keeps the film from feeling truly raw. A movie like The Martian only works if the actor in the middle of it works. That sounds obvious, but it's really the whole gamble here. You can have the Mars landscapes, the NASA control rooms, the rescue plans, the big technical language, all of that. But for huge stretches of this movie, it comes down to Matt Damon alone in a habitat, alone in a rover, alone in a spacesuit, or alone talking into a camera, because there is literally no one else there. And if he's boring, the movie is dead. Luckily, Damon understands exactly what kind of performance this story needs. He doesn't play Mark Watney like some untouchable genius or tragic martyr. He plays him like a very smart, very tired man who knows his situation is insane, but also knows that freaking out for too long is not going to help him. That makes him easy to watch. There's a casualness to the performance that keeps the film from becoming stiff. Watney is brilliant, yes, but Damon doesn't make him feel like a walking science textbook. He gives him irritation, sarcasm, stubbornness, little bursts of panic, and that very human habit of making jokes when everything is clearly terrible. It's not that he isn't scared. He is, but he keeps pushing the fear into action. That's the thing Damon sells best. Watney survives because he keeps moving mentally. You can see him processing, counting, reframing, trying to turn disaster into something he can manage, and Damon makes that watchable without overplaying it. He doesn't need to shout in every scene to show pressure. Sometimes it's just the look on his face when another plan goes wrong, or the way he pauses before forcing himself back into work. There's also a likability factor here that matters more than people admit. If you're going to spend this much time with one man stranded on Mars, you need to want him to make it. Not just because he's the protagonist, but because you enjoy his company. Damon brings that kind of everyday charm. He feels intelligent without being cold, funny without turning into a full-time comedian, and vulnerable without begging the audience for sympathy. That balance is important, because the film could have easily gone too far in either direction. Make Watney too heroic and he becomes fake, make him too broken and the movie becomes miserable. Damon finds a middle ground where you believe he is under impossible pressure, but you also believe he has the temperament to survive longer than most people would, and that's why the performance carries the movie. Even when the story cuts back to NASA or the crew in space, Watney remains the emotional center. Everything happening on Earth only matters because we've already spent time with him. We've seen him bleeding, calculating, joking, failing, growing food, and refusing to let Mars turn him into a memorial plaque. Some viewers may argue that he doesn't go dark enough emotionally, and that's a fair criticism. A real person in that situation would probably collapse in ways the movie only lightly touches. But Damon is not playing the harshest psychological version of this story. He's playing the version The Martian wants to be. Smart, tense, funny, hopeful, and easy to root for. And within that version, he's exactly what the film needs. He gives the movie its heartbeat. Without him, the science would feel dry, the survival scenes would feel mechanical, and the humor might not land at all. With him, Watney becomes more than the astronaut stranded on Mars. He becomes a person you're willing to follow through every repair, every calculation, every bad meal, and every lonely day. That's not a small achievement. For all the technical craft around him, The Martian still depends on one simple thing: whether Matt Damon can make one man alone on Mars feel interesting for more than 2 hours. And for the most part, he absolutely does. One of the smartest choices The Martian makes is giving Mark Watney a personality before giving him a rescue plan. Because let's be honest, a man alone on Mars could become painfully boring very quickly. There's only so many shots of someone walking through red dust, checking equipment, and eating sad survival food before the whole thing starts to feel like a very expensive science tutorial. But Watney doesn't let the movie become that. His humor is basically his survival instinct wearing a different outfit. He records video logs, talks through his plans, complains about his situation, makes sarcastic little observations, and reacts to disaster with that specific kind of this is terrible, but I guess we're doing this now energy. And it works because the humor doesn't feel completely separate from the danger. He's not joking because the situation is easy. He's joking because the situation is so awful that joking might be the only way to stay sane. That's an important difference. The movie understands that humor can be a defense mechanism. When Watney talks to the camera, he's documenting survival, yes, but he's also creating the illusion of conversation. He has no one to answer him, so the camera becomes the closest thing he has to another human being. That gives those video logs more weight than they first appear to have. At first, they're funny because he's explaining impossible problems in this casual, slightly annoyed way. But after a while, you realize those logs are part of his routine. They keep him organized. They keep his thoughts clear. They give him someone to talk to, even if that someone is just a future NASA technician, or maybe nobody at all. There's something lonely hidden inside the comedy, and Damon plays that tone really well. He doesn't make Watney into a stand-up comedian trapped in space. He makes him sound like a smart person trying not to let fear take over the room. Sometimes the jokes are sharp, sometimes they're dumb. Sometimes they feel like the exact kind of thing a person would say when they've been alone too long and need to hear a human voice, even if it's their own. That's what gives Watney charm. He's not just surviving because he knows science. He's surviving because he has the right attitude for disaster. He gets angry, but he doesn't stay uselessly angry. He gets scared, but he doesn't let fear freeze him. He gets bored, annoyed, tired, and probably deeply sick of his own company, but he keeps turning all of that into motion. And that survival personality is a big reason the film stays so watchable. If Watney were too serious, The Martian might become heavy and repetitive. If he were too goofy, the danger would disappear. The movie walks that line by making his humor practical. It keeps the audience engaged, but it also tells us something about him. This is a man who can look at a hopeless situation and still find a way to make a joke before getting back to work. That doesn't mean every joke lands perfectly. Some viewers may find the tone a little too light, especially for a story about being abandoned millions of miles from home. But for the version of the film Ridley Scott is making, the humor is essential. It keeps the movie human. It keeps Mars from becoming emotionally dead space. Because without those logs, without those sarcastic comments, without Watney's stubborn little bursts of personality, he could easily become just a problem for NASA to solve. Instead, he feels alive, not just biologically alive. Personally alive, still himself, still irritated by bad music, still amused by his own strange solutions, still willing to argue with a planet that has no intention of arguing back, and that's why the humor matters. It's not decoration, it's part of the fight. Every joke is Watney refusing to become silent. Every video log is him leaving proof that he was there, that he kept thinking, kept working, kept laughing when laughing made no sense at all. On Mars, that might be as important as food or oxygen, because once he loses that spark, the planet has already won. For a movie about a man abandoned on Mars, The Martian is surprisingly careful with loneliness. It doesn't ignore it. You can feel it in the empty rooms, the quiet routines, the way Watney keeps talking to cameras because there's no one else to talk to. But the film also doesn't sink completely into the psychological horror of being the only human being on an entire planet. And that's where the debate around Watney's emotional depth comes in. Some viewers see him as inspiring. He doesn't collapse. He doesn't let despair take over. He gets injured, realizes the entire world thinks he's dead, and then somehow forces himself into survival mode. That's powerful in its own way. There's something moving about a character who looks at certain death and says, "Not today, not yet, let me try one more thing." But there's another side to it. Because if you really stop and think about his situation, it's almost impossible to imagine the emotional damage. He is not stuck in a cabin during a snowstorm. He is not stranded on an island where at least the air is breathable and the ocean is alive. He is alone on Mars. Every day is the same red silence. Every meal is rationed. Every small failure could kill him. And for a long stretch, he has no confirmation that anyone even knows he survived. That should break a person, at least for a while. The movie gives us moments of anger, fear, frustration, and exhaustion, but it rarely lets Watney fully fall apart. He has controlled outbursts, he gets irritated, he reacts when plans collapse, but the film usually pulls him back into problem-solving pretty quickly. For some people, that makes him heroic. For others, it makes him feel a little too composed for the nightmare he's living through. And honestly, both reactions make sense. The Martian is not trying to be the darkest version of this story. It's not interested in watching Watney slowly lose his mind. This isn't a psychological breakdown film dressed up as science fiction. It's a survival adventure built around intelligence, humor, hope, and competence. So the movie chooses to emphasize the part of Watney that keeps functioning. That choice makes the film more entertaining, but it also softens the loneliness. There are moments where you almost want the movie to sit with him a little longer. Not for cheap misery, but just to feel the weight of those empty days. The repetition, the boredom, the terror of eating the same food, doing the same checks, staring at the same landscape, knowing that the smallest mistake might erase him before anyone can help. That kind of isolation has a sound to it, and sometimes the Martian moves past it faster than you expect. Still, Matt Damon does manage to suggest more than the script always says out loud. You can see little flashes of it. The forced cheerfulness, the tired eyes, the way humor sometimes feels less like confidence and more like a person trying to keep the room from going completely silent. Watney may not cry through half the movie, but you can sense that his personality is doing a lot of emotional labor. That's probably the most human part of him. He doesn't survive because he feels nothing. He survives because he refuses to let feelings make the decisions. He can be scared later. He can process the trauma later. Right now, he needs food. Right now, he needs water. Right now, he needs to stay alive until tomorrow. And maybe that's the point. Not every person expresses fear in a dramatic, obvious way. Some people joke. Some people work. Some people turn panic into lists because lists feel safer than emotions. Watney's loneliness is there, but it's often buried under tasks, sarcasm, and routine. Whether that feels emotionally honest or too polished depends on what kind of survival story you wanted. If you wanted raw psychological devastation, The Martian may feel too clean, too upbeat, almost too comfortable with its own optimism. But if you see Watney's humor and discipline as the only things keeping him from falling apart, then the performance becomes quietly affecting. Because underneath all the science and jokes, there is still one very sad truth. For a long time, Mark Watney is the loneliest person alive. The movie just chooses to show that loneliness through survival, not surrender. Now, while the humor in The Martian works for a lot of people, it's also one of the easiest parts of the movie to push back against. Because there is a point where Watney's attitude can either feel charming or a little too polished. The film clearly wants him to be funny, not just occasionally funny, but constantly capable of turning disaster into a punchline, and most of the time, that helps the movie. It keeps the story light, it makes him likable, and it stops the whole thing from becoming 2 hours of misery in a Mars habitat. But every now and then, you can feel the movie trying a bit too hard. Some of the one-liners have that written quality, where instead of sounding like a man trapped on Mars trying to stay sane, it starts to sound like a screenwriter, making sure the audience has something to laugh at. The danger is still there, but the jokes sometimes arrive so quickly that they take the edge off a scene that maybe needed a little more silence. And that's where the criticism comes from. There are moments when Watney should probably feel more terrified, more broken, more emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, he fires off another sarcastic comment, complains about disco music, or turns the situation into a witty little observation. For some viewers, that makes him resilient. For others, it makes the movie feel slightly artificial, like it's afraid to let the survival story become too uncomfortable. The tone can almost feel too audience-friendly. And I don't mean that as a complete insult. The Martian is built to entertain. It's not trying to be a bleak psychological nightmare. But when a story is about a man abandoned on another planet, there's a natural expectation that the isolation should hit harder than it sometimes does. So when the film keeps leaning on jokes, it can feel like it's smoothing out the roughest edges of its own premise. That jokey quality also connects back to the character's personality. Watney is written with this confident, slightly cocky, smart guy energy. A lot of people enjoy that. It gives him life. But if that style doesn't work for you, then spending so much time with him can become tiring. The same charm that pulls one viewer in might make another viewer feel like the movie thinks it is funnier than it really is. And that's a tricky balance, because humor in survival stories is not a bad thing. In fact, it can be very honest. People do make jokes during terrible situations. Sometimes laughter is the only thing keeping panic away, but the humor has to feel like it belongs to the moment. When it feels too clean, too timed, too ready-made for a trailer, it starts to weaken the reality the film worked so hard to build. That is probably the real issue. The Martian wants us to believe in the science, the danger, the distance, and the pressure. It wants Mars to feel deadly. But then, at certain points, the light tone almost protects the audience from feeling how deadly it really is. We're entertained, yes, but maybe not as shaken as we could have been. Still, I don't think this completely damages the film. It just depends on how much of that tone you can accept. If you enjoy Watney's personality, the jokes become part of the movie's identity. They make the survival story feel fresh and human. But if the humor doesn't land for you, then the whole film can start to feel a little too smug, a little too neat, maybe even a little emotionally safe. And that's why this criticism matters. The Martian is at its best when the humor feels like a man refusing to give up. It is weaker when the humor feels like the movie refusing to slow down and let the fear breathe. One of the strangest little pleasures in The Martian is the disco music. And I say strange because, at first, it almost feels like a random joke that wandered in from another movie. Mark Watney is stuck on Mars, fighting for his life, trying to grow potatoes in a habitat that could kill him if one thing goes wrong. And then suddenly, there's this upbeat 70s music playing like the universe has decided to mock him personally. It's ridiculous, but that's kind of why it works. The music belongs to Commander Lewis, not Watney, and because she left it behind, he is now trapped with it. Not just physically trapped on Mars, but emotionally trapped with someone else's playlist. That detail is funny because it's so specific. Out of all the things a person could be forced to endure while stranded on another planet, endless disco is somehow both harmless and deeply cruel, and the movie knows it. Watney's hatred of the music becomes one of those small running jokes that gives the survival story a bit of flavor. He's not just battling starvation, broken systems, and impossible distance. He's also battling ABBA and all the shiny, cheerful music he never asked for. That contrast is what makes it memorable. Mars is silent, empty, and deadly. Disco is loud, colorful, and almost aggressively alive. So when those songs cut through the bleakness of the environment, they create this odd little clash between the seriousness of the situation and the absurdity of what Watney has to live with day after day. It also makes the loneliness feel more human, because in real life, survival is not always dramatic in a clean way. Sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's annoying. Sometimes the thing that gets under your skin is not the massive life or death problem, but the stupid little inconvenience that won't go away. For Watney, that inconvenience happens to be disco music, and honestly, that feels believable. When someone is isolated for that long, small things become huge. A song you dislike becomes torture. A limited routine becomes irritating. A tiny reminder of another person's taste becomes almost personal. The music gives Watney something to complain about, and weirdly, that complaint keeps him connected to ordinary human behavior. It's not just a soundtrack choice, it's characterization. Watney's reactions to the songs tell us about him. He's sarcastic, impatient, funny, and still mentally present enough to be annoyed by something as silly as music. That annoyance becomes proof that he hasn't been reduced to pure survival mode. He's still himself, still judging, still complaining, still finding something ridiculous inside the nightmare. The disco also gives the movie a lighter pulse. Without it, The Martian could easily become more visually impressive than emotionally varied. Red landscapes, white suits, metallic interiors, NASA rooms, all of that can start to feel controlled and clean. The music breaks that up. It adds personality. It gives certain scenes a bounce they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think that's part of why people remember it. There are plenty of serious space movies with grand orchestral scores and heavy silence. The Martian has those moments too, but then it also has this weird, cheerful soundtrack running through Watney's misery. It's a reminder that the film is not trying to be pure despair. It wants to be tense, yes, but also fun. It wants the audience to worry about Watney and still laugh at the absurd details of his situation. Now, does the joke work for everyone? Not exactly. Some viewers may find it overplayed, and honestly, I can understand that. If the disco gag doesn't land for you, it might feel like the movie keeps nudging you in the ribs, saying, "Look, isn't this funny?" But when it does work, it gives the film something oddly charming. Because being stranded on Mars is terrifying. Being stranded on Mars with only disco music is somehow worse in a much funnier way, and that tiny absurdity is very much part of The Martian's identity. It takes a massive survival story and fills it with small, human irritations. It understands that even at the edge of death, people still have opinions about bad music. That's what makes the running joke stick. It doesn't just lighten the mood. It reminds us that Mark Watney is not a symbol, not a myth, not just the astronaut who survived Mars. He's a guy stuck very far from home, doing everything he can to stay alive while slowly losing an argument with a disco playlist. Now, the disco joke is memorable, but it's also one of those parts of The Martian that can very easily split the room. Some people find it funny, some people find it charming. And then there are viewers who reach a point where they're thinking, okay, we get it. He hates disco. Can we move on now? And honestly, I can understand both reactions. At first, the joke works because it gives the movie a very specific comic texture. Watney is not just stranded on Mars. He is stranded on Mars with someone else's music collection. That's a funny detail. It gives him something petty to complain about in the middle of a situation that is anything but petty. But the longer the film goes on, the joke can start to feel a little stretched. There are only so many times the movie can remind us that the disco playlist is bad before the humor begins to lose its surprise. What starts as a clever character detail can, for some viewers, become a repeated button the film keeps pressing whenever it wants to lighten the mood. And that's where the backlash makes sense, because The Martian already has a very delicate tonal balance. It's trying to be tense, emotional, funny, smart, and accessible all at once. Most of the time, it manages that balance well. But when the disco gag keeps returning, it can sometimes feel like the film is working too hard to keep everything breezy, almost like it doesn't fully trust the audience to sit in the loneliness. That's the real issue, I think. The music itself is not the problem. The problem is repetition. A survival story needs texture, but it also needs space. There are moments where silence might have made Mars feel colder, lonelier, and more frightening. Instead, the movie occasionally fills that space with upbeat music or another joke about how terrible the playlist is. For some viewers, that makes the film more entertaining. For others, it breaks the spell. Because when you're watching a man stranded on another planet, fighting against hunger, injury, isolation, and time, a constantly playful soundtrack can make the danger feel less sharp. It doesn't erase the stakes, but it does soften them. And if you wanted The Martian to lean harder into desperation, the disco can feel like the movie, dodging its own emotional weight. There's also a slightly forced quality to the way the joke is sometimes framed. The film doesn't just let the music exist in the background. It makes sure you notice it. It makes sure Watney reacts to it. It makes sure the audience understands the contrast. Deadly Mars, silly music. And while that contrast is funny the first few times, it can become a little too obvious, like the movie keeps explaining its own joke. Still, I don't think the soundtrack choice is a failure. Far from it. It gives The Martian personality, and without it, the film might have felt more generic. The disco becomes part of the movie's identity, for better or worse. You may love it, you may hate it, but you probably remember it, and that matters. The only question is whether the joke earns all the space it takes up. For me, it mostly does, but I can't pretend the criticism is unfair. There are moments where the music feels fresh and human, and moments where it starts to feel like a gimmick being pushed one scene too far. That's the danger with any running joke. If it keeps evolving, it stays funny. If it simply repeats, it starts to feel mechanical. And with The Martian, the disco sits right on that line. Sometimes it's a hilarious reminder that Watney is still a normal guy with normal annoyances. Other times, it feels like the film is trying to make isolation more marketable, more upbeat, more comfortable than it really should be. So the backlash is not really about disco itself. It's about whether the movie's lighter touches occasionally get in the way of the harsher survival story underneath. For viewers who connect with the film's optimism, the music is part of the fun. For viewers who wanted something more raw, it may feel like one joke too many echoing across an already empty planet. What keeps The Martian from becoming just a one-man survival film is everything happening back on Earth. Because while Mark Watney is stuck on Mars trying to stretch food, repair equipment, and not die in the most expensive desert imaginable, NASA is dealing with a completely different kind of pressure. At first, they believe they've lost him. They're not planning a rescue. They're managing a tragedy. Public statements, internal grief, mission fallout. The whole world thinks Mark Watney is dead, and then they realize he isn't. That discovery changes the entire movie. Suddenly, Watney's survival is not just his private fight anymore. It becomes a global problem. NASA has to figure out how to contact him, how to supply him, how to bring him home, and maybe worst of all, how to do all of that while knowing every failure could happen in front of the entire world. That's what makes the Earthside story interesting. It's not as visually dramatic as Mars, obviously. Nobody is driving across red landscapes or patching up habitats with death waiting outside the door. But the tension is still there, just in a different form. It's in the meetings, the arguments, the calculations, the uncomfortable choices. It's people in rooms trying to solve a problem that sounds impossible before anyone even starts. And the film makes those rooms feel alive. Mission Control could have easily become boring. A bunch of people staring at screens, saying technical things, waiting for updates that can kill a movie fast. But The Martian keeps that side moving because every NASA scene is tied to a specific question. Can they see him? Can they talk to him? Can they send food? Can they risk the crew? Can they tell the public everything? Can they save one man without endangering many others? Those questions give the Earthside rescue story real momentum. It also helps that the people at NASA are not treated like faceless background experts. They have different priorities, different fears, different ways of thinking. Some are cautious, some are emotional, some are politically aware. Some are willing to take risks because, from their point of view, leaving Watney there is not acceptable. And that creates a nice contrast with Mars. On Mars, Watney's problems are physical and immediate: food, water, air, communication. On Earth, the problems are organizational. Budgets, launches, public pressure, timing, safety, responsibility. One side is survival through improvisation. The other side is survival through coordination. The rescue operation also gives the movie that big crowd-pleasing feeling. Not in a cheap way, at least most of the time. There is something genuinely satisfying about watching intelligent people gather around one impossible goal. Nobody is trying to defeat a villain. Nobody is trying to win a war. They are trying to bring one person home. That gives the film a surprisingly optimistic view of institutions and expertise. NASA is not perfect in the movie. There are political concerns, communication issues, disagreements, and moments where leadership has to choose between bad options. But overall, the film respects competence. It believes in scientists, engineers, astronauts, planners, and people who know how to stay calm when the situation is falling apart. And honestly, that feels refreshing. A lot of movies create drama by making organizations useless or corrupt. The Martian does have bureaucracy, yes, but it also shows people working hard and caring deeply. Even when they disagree, most of them are trying to solve the same problem. That gives the rescue effort a sense of sincerity. It's not just can Mark survive, it becomes how far will people go to save him. That's where the Earthside story earns its place. It expands the emotional scale of the film. Watney may be alone physically, but once NASA discovers he's alive, he is no longer alone in the story. Every calculation, every launch attempt, every risky idea becomes a reminder that there are people millions of miles away refusing to give up on him. And that's a big part of why the movie works as mainstream entertainment. The Martian understands that survival is compelling, but rescue is emotional. Watching Watney fight to stay alive is satisfying. Watching an entire team slowly realize they might be able to bring him home gives the film its bigger heartbeat. Mars gives the movie its danger. NASA gives it hope. One thing The Martian does pretty well is show that saving Mark Watney isn't just a science problem. It's also a leadership problem. Because once NASA finds out he's alive, the situation becomes messy very quickly. Not messy in the dramatic villain kind of way, where someone is secretly trying to sabotage the rescue. It's more realistic than that. There are people in charge who have to think about risk, public image, money, crew safety, mission reputation, and the terrifying possibility of making one wrong call in front of the entire world. That's where Jeff Daniels' character, Teddy Sanders, comes in. He's not exactly warm. He's not the emotional heart of the rescue. He's the guy sitting in the chair where every choice has consequences. And depending on how you watch the movie, he can either feel like a practical leader doing a terrible job under pressure, or a stiff bureaucrat who cares too much about politics and not enough about the man stranded on Mars. Honestly, both readings are kind of there. The film doesn't make him a villain, and that's important. He isn't sitting around hoping Watney dies because it would be convenient, but he is thinking like an administrator. He has to. If a rescue plan fails, more astronauts could die. If NASA hides information, the public backlash could explode. If they rush something impossible, the entire organization might be blamed for turning one tragedy into a bigger one. So his caution makes sense, but it also frustrates you, because we, as viewers, are emotionally attached to Watney. We've seen him alone, injured, farming potatoes, talking to himself, trying to stay alive with duct tape and stubbornness. So when someone at NASA says, maybe we shouldn't risk everything, it feels cold, even if the logic is not completely wrong. That's what gives the mission control scenes their tension. It's not just people solving equations. It's people arguing over responsibility. Who gets to decide what risk is acceptable? Does NASA tell the crew everything? Does the public deserve the full truth immediately? Is one man's life worth risking an entire mission? These are not simple questions, and the movie is stronger because it at least lets those questions exist. The public relations angle adds another layer too. Once the world knows Watney is alive, NASA is no longer operating in private. Every decision becomes part of a global story. Mark isn't just an astronaut anymore. He's a symbol, a man left behind, a man the world is watching, a man whose survival has become tied to NASA's image, pride, and moral responsibility. And that pressure changes everything. You can feel how uncomfortable the leadership position is. If they fail, they don't just lose Mark. They lose trust. They lose credibility. They lose the comforting idea that human beings can go into space and still be protected by the people back home. So behind all the technical planning, there's this constant fear of what the rescue means politically. That might sound dry, but it helps the movie. Because if The Martian was only about Watney fixing things on Mars, it might start to feel repetitive after a while. the bureaucracy gives the story another kind of obstacle. Mars is dangerous because it is physically hostile. NASA is complicated because human systems are slow, cautious, and full of competing priorities. And in some ways, that's more believable than any big villain would have been. The movie understands that in real life, the obstacle is often not one evil person. It's the meeting, the chain of command, the press conference, the budget, the fear of blame. The person saying, "We need to think this through," when everyone else wants to run straight into the rescue. That's why the Earth-side politics are useful. They make the rescue feel bigger than a technical operation. They turn it into a test of institutional courage. NASA has to decide not only whether it can save Watney, but whether it is willing to take the public and professional risk of trying. And that gives the film a slightly more grounded edge. Not every exciting decision can be made instantly. Not every good idea can be approved just because it sounds heroic. Sometimes the right thing has to fight its way through caution, fear, procedure, and reputation. The Martian may be a hopeful movie, but it doesn't completely ignore the weight of leadership. It shows that bringing Mark home is not just about having brilliant scientists in the room. It's about whether the people in charge are willing to put their names, their careers, and maybe other lives on the line for one man still breathing on a planet that already tried to bury him. One of the more refreshing things about The Martian is that it doesn't need a villain. There's no evil scientist hiding information for personal gain, no rival astronaut trying to sabotage the mission. No greedy corporate figure saying, "Leave him there, it costs too much." The movie could have gone that route very easily, because Hollywood loves giving every story a human obstacle with a face and a dramatic speech. But The Martian doesn't really do that. The enemy is Mars, and not Mars in some magical, angry, personified way. Mars isn't out to get Mark Watney. That's almost what makes it scarier. The planet isn't cruel, it's indifferent. It doesn't care that he's clever. It doesn't care that NASA wants him back. It doesn't care that his crew feels guilty. It just sits there, silent and lethal, waiting for the math to stop working. That gives the film a different kind of tension. Because in a normal movie, you can defeat the villain. You can expose them, fight them, outsmart them, shoot them, arrest them, whatever the genre demands. But how do you defeat distance? How do you argue with time? How do you punch a food shortage? Watney is stuck fighting problems that don't have emotions, and that makes every small victory feel temporary. He can grow food, but the supply still has limits. He can fix equipment, but it can break again. He can make plans, but Mars doesn't promise to cooperate. That's what gives the survival story its pressure. The threats are basic, almost boring on paper: hunger, cold, oxygen, pressure, communication, travel distance. But the movie makes them feel dramatic because each one is unavoidable. These aren't random obstacles thrown in for excitement. They are the natural conditions of being alive somewhere humans are not supposed to be. And I like that the film doesn't turn NASA into the bad guy either. Sure, there's bureaucracy. There are arguments, there are political concerns. Some decisions feel cold, but most of the people on Earth are not trying to abandon Watney. They are trying to solve something that may not be solvable. That matters because it gives the movie a surprisingly generous view of people. The conflict doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from limits, human limits, technological limits, time limits. Even the crew who left Mark behind aren't villains. That's important too. The movie never frames them as cowards. They made the call they thought they had to make during a disaster. They believed he was dead. And once the truth comes out, the emotional weight of that decision stays with them. The drama comes from guilt, responsibility, and the need to correct a tragedy, not from betrayal. That makes The Martian feel cleaner than a lot of big survival films, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's not about people being awful to each other. It's about people being small in front of something enormous. Mars, space, distance, orbital timing, these things are bigger than anyone's ego. They don't care about speeches. They don't bend because someone has a heroic moment. The only way through is patience, intelligence, cooperation, and a ridiculous amount of luck. And that's actually a big part of the movie's appeal. It's nice, honestly, to watch a film where the main conflict is not human stupidity. The characters mostly try to do the right thing. They disagree, yes, but they're not idiots. They don't create danger just because the script needs a problem. The danger already exists. Not because the film suddenly becomes sentimental, but because we understand the distance everyone had to cross, physically, technically, emotionally. Watney is not just being rescued from Mars. He is being rescued from isolation, from being written off as dead, from the idea that one man can simply be lost because the math is too difficult. That's what gives the final stretch its power. The rescue is exciting, yes, but underneath the tension there's something warmer happening. The entire film has been building toward a very simple human idea. If someone is still alive, you try to bring them home, even if it's expensive. Even if it's risky, even if the chances are ridiculous, you try. And honestly, that kind of optimism feels good. The Martian is not a cynical movie. It has politics, disagreements, failures, and pressure, but deep down it believes people can come together when the situation demands it. Scientists, astronauts, engineers, administrators, even people watching from around the world, they all become part of this shared hope that Watney might survive. That could have felt cheesy. And to be fair, for some viewers, maybe it does. The global reaction shots, the mission control tension, the final moments of everyone waiting for the outcome, these are familiar beats. We've seen this kind of thing in other space movies and disaster films. The crowd holds its breath, the room goes quiet. The movie uses those details to keep the danger present even when the scene itself is calm. And then there's the score. The musical score is not always the loudest element in the film, but it gives the story a sense of scale and emotion. It knows when to stay subtle, when to support tension, and when to let the rescue effort feel big. The movie already has that famous disco contrast, but the actual score has a different job. It carries the seriousness underneath the jokes. It reminds us that, yes, the film is fun, but the situation is still enormous. That balance is crucial, because if the music leaned too hard into tragedy, The Martian could become heavy in a way that doesn't really fit its personality. If it leaned too hard into fun, the stakes might feel lighter than they should. The score mostly understands the tone, hopeful, tense, sometimes grand, but not suffocating. It gives the film emotional shape without forcing every feeling down your throat. The technical craft also shows up in the way the movie handles scale. Mars feels huge. NASA feels busy. The spacecraft feels isolated in its own way. These locations don't blend together, and that helps the storytelling. You can feel the difference between Watney's lonely survival routine, the organized pressure of mission control, and the crew's life aboard the ship. Each space has its own rhythm, its own texture, its own kind of pressure. That's not accidental. A film like this depends on clarity. If the audience gets lost in the technology, the tension disappears. If we don't understand where people are or what they're trying to do, the rescue becomes noise. The Martian does a good job making complex situations feel readable. You usually know what the problem is, what the plan is, and why it might fail. That kind of clarity is part of the craft. It's not flashy, but it's essential. The editing, design, sound, and score are all working together to make the survival mechanics feel dramatic without becoming confusing. The film wants the audience to stay emotionally connected, not stuck trying to decode the mission manual. Of course, some viewers might feel the movie looks and sounds a little too polished. The sets are clean, the technology is sleek, the whole production has that big-budget studio smoothness. And yes, there's a version of this story that could have been rougher, quieter, maybe more uncomfortable. But The Martian is not aiming for that version. It's aiming for intelligent, mainstream entertainment. So the technical craft is designed to be immersive, clear, and accessible. It gives you the feeling of a believable near-future space mission without making the world so gritty that the movie loses its wider appeal. And honestly, that's a big reason the film is so easy to watch. The production design makes the mission feel real. The sound keeps the machinery and danger alive. The score gives the rescue its emotional lift. Together, these elements create a world where the science feels physical, the stakes feel immediate, and the story keeps moving smoothly from one crisis to the next. The best technical work is often the kind you stop noticing because you believe it. And in The Martian, that's exactly what happens. After a while, you're not thinking about sets, sound mixes, or production design. You're thinking about oxygen, food, pressure, distance, and whether one man can keep trusting the machines around him long enough to make it home. What's interesting about The Martian is that it feels like Ridley Scott making a big science fiction movie without trying to make it feel like a Ridley Scott sci-fi event. And I mean that in a good way. This isn't Alien. It isn't Blade Runner. It isn't some dark, philosophical, visually heavy vision of the future where every frame feels haunted. The Martian is much warmer than that, cleaner, more direct, more audience-friendly. It still has scale, danger, and visual confidence, but Scott doesn't smother the story under style. He keeps the focus where it needs to be, on the situation, the process, and the people trying to solve it. That restraint is a big reason the movie works, because this could have easily become too much. Too dramatic, too sentimental, too technical, too glossy, too self-important. A man stranded on Mars is already a huge premise. The director doesn't need to keep shouting at us about how huge it is. Scott seems to understand that the best way to sell the danger is to make the world feel practical and believable, then let the problems do the work. And most of the time, he does exactly that. The Mars scenes have scope, but they're not just pretty postcards. The NASA scenes have energy, but they don't feel like empty boardroom filler. The crew scenes have guilt and responsibility without turning into melodrama. Scott manages all these moving pieces with a steady hand, which matters because The Martian is not a tiny story. It has one man alone, a whole Earthside rescue operation, astronauts in space, public pressure, technical setbacks, and still somehow it has to remain clear. That's not easy. A weaker version of this movie could have become confusing very quickly. Too many characters, too many calculations, too much bouncing between locations, but Scott keeps the story readable. You usually know where you are, what the problem is, and why the next decision matters. That kind of clarity is not flashy, but it is good directing. The film also benefits from the source material. Andy Weir's story has a very strong engine, one impossible problem after another, solved through science, humor, and stubbornness. That structure gives the movie momentum. It's not just man waits for rescue, it's man survives long enough to create the possibility of rescue. That difference is everything. Watney is active, NASA is active, the crew is active, everyone is trying something. That keeps the film alive. The adaptation understands that the appeal is not only the science, it's the attitude toward science, the joy of figuring things out, the satisfaction of watching a mind work under pressure. The strange comedy of someone treating Mars like the worst workplace emergency imaginable. That tone could have been very hard to translate, because too much technical detail might have slowed the movie down, while too little would have made it feel fake. The film finds a pretty good middle ground. It gives us enough detail to feel intelligent, but not so much that the story turns into homework. It keeps Watney's explanations casual. It lets the NASA team speak with authority. It makes complicated rescue planning feel dramatic without requiring the audience to pause and draw diagrams. That's the strength of the adaptation. It turns the book's problem-solving structure into something cinematic. And Drew Goddard's screenplay deserves credit for that too. The writing keeps the tone light without making the stakes disappear. It gives Watney enough wit to remain engaging, gives the supporting cast enough personality to keep the Earth scenes from going flat, and keeps returning to the central emotional goal. Bring him home, even when the science gets complicated, the emotional line stays simple. That's important, because The Martian could have been admired more than enjoyed. It could have been one of those films people respect for research and technical accuracy, but don't actually feel much while watching. Instead, it's genuinely entertaining. It moves, it jokes, it builds tension, it gives the audience small victories to hold on to. That combination comes from both the source material and the way Scott shapes it for the screen. Now, is it one of Scott's darkest or most daring films? No, not really, but it may be one of his most purely enjoyable ones. There's a confidence here, a kind of relaxed command, where he doesn't seem interested in proving how important the movie is. He just tells the story cleanly and lets the craftsmanship show through. The result feels big without being bloated, smart without being cold, and hopeful without completely losing tension. That's a difficult balance, and it's probably why so many viewers saw this as a strong return for him. The adaptation also avoids one major trap. It doesn't let Watney become the whole movie in a narrow way. Yes, he is the center, but the film keeps expanding outward. Mars, NASA, the crew, the world watching, all of it turns the survival story into something larger. That gives the movie scale without losing its human focus. And that's where Scott's direction and Weir's premise really meet. Weir gives the story its brain, the science, the process, the problem-solving momentum. Scott gives it body, the visuals, the pacing, the environment, the scale. And the screenplay gives it a voice, funny, clear, accessible, and emotionally direct. When those pieces are working together, The Martian becomes more than just a stranded astronaut movie. It becomes a celebration of human competence. Not in a cheesy way where everyone gives speeches about greatness, but in the simple pleasure of watching people think, fail, regroup, and try again. That's the real strength of the film. It takes a premise that could have been dry or depressing and turns it into something surprisingly alive. A survival story with brains, a space movie with humor, a big Ridley Scott production that still remembers the most important thing is one man trying to last one more day. And when an adaptation understands its own heartbeat that clearly, you can feel it. So when everything is said and done, The Martian is one of those movies that is very easy to recommend, even if it is not impossible to criticize. And that's kind of the interesting thing about it. On one hand, it has so many obvious strengths. It's entertaining, it moves well for a long film, it has a great central performance from Matt Damon, the Mars visuals are convincing, the rescue story has real momentum, and Ridley Scott keeps the whole thing polished without making it feel completely lifeless. For a big studio space movie, it's smarter than average, funnier than expected, and far more approachable than a lot of science-heavy films usually are. That's why it works for such a wide audience. You don't need to be obsessed with space travel to enjoy it. You don't need to understand every scientific detail. you just need to understand the basic emotional situation. A man is stranded somewhere impossible, and a lot of people are trying very hard to bring him home. That's a clean, powerful hook, and the Martian knows exactly how to use it. But at the same time, I do understand why the movie doesn't work for everyone. It is predictable. Let's be honest about that. You can feel the shape of the story pretty early. This is not a film built around shocking twists or moral darkness or some ending that completely changes the meaning of everything. It's a survival and rescue movie, and it moves toward the kind of emotional payoff you expect from that setup. For some viewers, that predictability is comforting. For others, it makes the film feel too safe. And that safe feeling is probably the biggest criticism I can give it. The Martian is intense, but rarely brutal. It is emotional, but not emotionally devastating. It is realistic in texture, but still very polished in structure. Even when terrible things happen, the film has this smooth mainstream confidence that tells you, deep down, the story knows where it is going. That can make the danger feel slightly softened. There are moments where the movie could have sat longer with Watney's loneliness, his fear, his boredom, the psychological weight of being the only human being on an entire planet. Instead, it often returns quickly to humor, science, problem-solving, or NASA planning. That keeps the pace alive, yes, but it also means the film sometimes avoids the rawest version of its own premise. And yet, I don't think that ruins it, because The Martian was never trying to be the bleakest possible story about isolation. It's not trying to punish the audience. It's not trying to make Mars feel like a nightmare you can't escape from. It's a hopeful survival movie, a crowd pleaser, a film about intelligence, cooperation, patience, and refusing to treat impossible odds as a final answer. And judged on that level, it does its job extremely well. The divisive part comes from what you want the movie to be. If you want hard, unforgiving realism, you may find some of the plot solutions too convenient. If you want deep psychological collapse, Watney may seem too cheerful or too composed. If you dislike the humor, the disco jokes and sarcastic video logs might become irritating fast. And if you've seen a lot of space and survival films, you may feel like the movie is working with familiar pieces. Those criticisms are fair, but familiar doesn't always mean ineffective. The Martian takes familiar ingredients and arranges them with confidence. The stranded man setup, the NASA rescue operation, the ticking clock, the global attention. The final push to bring someone home. None of these ideas are completely new, but the film delivers them with enough charm, clarity, and energy that they still land. That's the difference between formula and craft. A lazy formula feels like the movie is just checking boxes. The Martian, at its best, feels like skilled filmmakers taking a familiar structure and making it satisfying again. It may not reinvent the survival genre, but it understands why that genre works. We like watching people fight to live. We like watching experts solve problems. We like seeing hope survive in a place where hope has no business existing. And maybe that's why the movie stays memorable, not because every scene is groundbreaking, not because every joke lands, not because every scientific detail is beyond debate. It stays memorable because it has a very strong emotional center. Mark Watney wants to live. NASA wants to save him. His crew wants to make things right. Mars doesn't care about any of them. That's enough. The film also leaves you with a good feeling, and I don't think that should be dismissed. Sometimes a movie earns its optimism. The Martian does. It spends over 2 hours showing people fail, adjust, argue, calculate, and keep trying. So when the film finally reaches its hopeful conclusion, it doesn't feel empty. It feels like the natural result of stubborn effort. Is it a perfect movie? No. Is it overrated by some people? Maybe. Is it too klein, too convenient, and a little too pleased with its own light tone in places? I can see that. But it is also genuinely entertaining, well acted, visually impressive, and far more engaging than a movie about Mars survival math had any right to be. It's the kind of film that can pull in casual viewers while still giving science fiction fans something to enjoy. It's big without being brainless, emotional without drowning in sadness, and funny without completely losing the stakes. That's a hard balance to pull off. So my final feeling is this. The Martian may not be the most daring space movie ever made, and it may not be the rawest survival film ever made, but it is a very effective one. It knows its audience. It knows its tone. It knows how to turn problem-solving into suspense and isolation into entertainment. And even if you can predict where it's going, the journey still has enough energy to keep you watching. That, to me, is the real success of The Martian. It takes one man, one dead planet, a pile of impossible problems, and somehow turns all of that into a smart, funny, hopeful ride home.